Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another beautiful day in Western Asia. So today we are going to be looking at the Seleukid Empire, alternatively spelled instead of a K with a C. You may see it switched. There's many different spellings between the Greek and the Latin versions, so I apologize, but if they sound the same, they mean the same. So the Seleukid Empire is again one of those empires that came out from the Wars of the Diadochoi, the Wars of the Successors. So just like the Ptolemies, the Seleucids came out and forged their own empire, much larger than the Ptolemaic kingdom, and ruled roughly until 141 BCE. One could say 129 BCE, which is one of the final battles that the Seleucids had with the next empire in line, the Parthians. And one could even say 63 BCE when the Seleukid state in Syria was subsumed by the Roman Empire. It really depends on who you ask. Generally, I use around 141 BCE to denote the end of the Seleucids, mainly because a majority of their area was then taken over by the Parthians. So as I said, the Seleucids ran roughly from all the way in Anatolia, deep over into Central Asia, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, all of those areas over there, and deep into southern Iran and most of kind of northern Arabia. In the modern states we know today as Iraq, Iran, Syria, Israel. And one of the main questions that we are going to start to look at is how do we get from the Achaemenid style of architecture to the Sasanian style of architecture, of who we will end the semester on in a few short weeks, if you can believe it. And as you can see here, we have the Apadana with its site plan at the site of Persepolis to another site, the so-called Evan Ekestra or Tak Ekestra, and its site plan here. And really is the question, how do we get from the prestige architecture of the hypostyle hall, how do we get from that to the prestige architecture of the Sasanians with the Avon, or this large unsupported vault? And that's really something that we want to think about as we go through the rest of the semester, is what are those ties between the Achaemenids and the Sasanians? Are there any ties? Or is it just kind of something that we think of ourselves as a kind of a heuristic thing, and the Sasanians really didn't have any sort of connection to the Achaemenids? So that's one of the questions that I want you to think about as we move on throughout the rest of the semester. So Seleucus the First Nicator, so the victor, another great name, was basically the founder of the Seleukid Empire, and he was one of those. He was one of the ones to come out as one of the victorious generals in the Wars of the Diadochoi, and he really seems to have basically taken over everything. He was the one, as I said, with the most amount of space in his empire, and controlled the most resources, the most land, and the most people. And as Arrian says here in the Anabasis of Alexander, that Seleucus was the greatest king of those who came out of Alexander's rule, and he had the most royal mind and ruled over the greatest extent, next to Alexander himself. So Seleucus was really seen as one of these great generals and great political minds. And it seems to be that because he was able to unify such a disparate grouping of peoples, all the way from the Mediterranean in the west to the Hindu Kush in the east, under a similar system of governance, he really does seem to have been that great political mastermind. Now, part of the Seleukid strategies of legitimization, God, that is such a difficult word. is that they started a new era. So they started the Seleukid era. So year one corresponded to the founding of the Seleukid Empire. And honestly, what's one of the really interesting facts, as the Seleucids are full of interesting facts, but one of the really interesting ones is that the so-called Seleukid era, or the year of the Greeks, continues on well into the modern age even. And some of the Eastern churches, so the Assyrian Church or the Church of the East, still uses the Greek year in order to kind of delimit or delineate time. So just as the Catholic Church and kind of the rest of the Western world uses the Anno Domini, so the year zero relating to Christ, the Church of the East uses in the year of the Greeks in order to designate their time. But this foundation of a new era, very much for the Seleucids, speaks to them. They brought up something new, is that it's a whole new reckoning of time that is beholden to the Seleucids themselves. And now their coinage, most had on their reverse an image of a god, or on the obverse an image of the god. And it was depending on kind of the mint and the time period. Generally, it was either Zeus, Tyche, or Apollo. And that seems to be the general gods that were used. Now, for iconography, their main symbol was an anchor. So they used basically an anchor, as you can see on the bottom here, to show the Seleukid, the kind of like the Seleukid family crest. Now, a lot of people seem to think that there is like, there's a relation to the names of them. Generally, it seems to be that it has something to do with naval prowess. We don't quite know. Another iconography that seems to kind of come throughout the entirety of the Seleukid reign is this charging bull motif. As you can see here, it's a very rampant bull. And a horse's head with horns on it. So kind of speaking to that the bull of Amun, or kind of speaking to how Alexander had his horns, and we'll see that on some of the obverses of coins in which the horn is also deployed. Now, city foundations were also another major part. So just as we've spoke time and time again about founding cities, it basically was the same for the Seleucids. And they seem to have made Seleukid cities under their own names. So there were some Alexandrias, again, being kind of harkening back to Alexander the Great, but there were many Antiochs and Seleukias, Laodiceas, and Stratoniceas, which were all named after the Seleukid dynastic line. So Antiochus, Seleucus, Laodicea is one of the wives, Stratoniceia, one of the wives. So very much beholden to this idea of city foundation as a sign of a good king. Under the second generation of Seleucids, so this is essentially following the reign of Seleucus I, we see a kind of a circulation of Apollo as being the father of Seleucus I. So Apollo, that one with the oracle at Delphi, and Apollo starts to become very important, and they use him as kind of the divine progenitor of the Seleukid line. So just as Alexander made his claim to kind of Zeus and Hercules, the Seleucids looked to Apollo as their divine ancestor to kind of legitimate their own idea of kingship. There's also many stories of Seleucus, of his exploits and his kind of divine demeanor, and they also established these cult sites of Seleucus and the ancestors. So just like we saw with the Tikaon at Alexandria, similar thing is going on in the Achaemenid, or not the Achaemenid, in the Seleukid Empire, my apologies, for them to be able to kind of divinely inspire their rule, to show people and to kind of give that idea that, yes, you are making offerings to our ancestors who are gods, ergo, we are gods. And they continued local traditions, with the main one being the Akitu festival. So, as we spoke about in the well, I believe that would have been the last test, before the last test. So the Akitu festival with the Babylonians, the kind of coming of the new year, that renewal of kingship. And there is one story, I believe it was Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, who was doing the Akitu festival, but instead of being slapped, he said, "That's not going to happen. I'm not going to get slapped." And that was, I believe, there is that is related in the Paul Cosman reading that I signed. I believe it is in one of those chapters. But it's a fun little story. I was like, yeah, we're going to do the Akitu festival, but there's no way that you are going to slap me, because I am divine, and you don't slap a god. So for the Babylonians, the king wasn't a god, but they were divinely ordained to rule. As to where for the Seleucids, they were sons of gods, and that basically transfers into them being gods themselves. And you'll see here we have a depiction of Apollo with his bow and arrow sitting on this thing called the omphalos. And we will talk a little bit more about that later. But the omphalos is the navel of the world that was located at Delphi. So looking at a bit of the images of Seleucus, we see that he is continuing that idea of the Alexandrine portrait, as to he's kind of looking up, his head is cocked to the side, looking to the gods, very much continuing on with that idea of the iconography of Alexander that was then used for Seleucus. And we see here on this coin, we have that horn and the bull's ears. So again, harkening back to that divinely ordained style of Alexander. Now, a really interesting fact is that this coin here was given in a trade from the British Museum to the Metropolitan Museum in New York, because the Metropolitan Museum financially backed an excavation at Tepe Nushejan in Iran. So it was kind of this coin had already been excavated at Pasargadae, and the excavators and the British Museum gave it to the Met Museum as part of a thanks for giving us funding for another excavation that we did. Now, you'll notice that I mentioned that this was excavated at Pasargadae, this coin was. So the Seleucids continued to use Pasargadae in a couple of ways. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, about how the Seleucids appropriated, abandoned, and reused Achaemenid sites of imperial power. We also have this lovely bronze bust in the Naples Museum that shows Seleucus as kind of this partially young and partially old, kind of playing with both ideas of his Alexandrian nature, as with the hair and the slightly looking up, the very almost imperceptible tilt of the head, but again, a little bit more grizzled nature to his face that speaks more to his kind of experience as a king and an older gentleman. So there, as you'll probably see in the scholarship, especially as you continue on, if you do continue on with the study of kind of the Hellenistic East, is they seem to think of the Seleucids as these colonizers, as to they came in and colonized the world, forced Greek traditions on the locals, and basically what people think of as kind of the bad side of colonization. The other side of that is that the Seleucids were kind of the heirs or the continuators of the Achaemenid Empire, as to where they came in and basically were Greek names, but Achaemenid in all of their aspect. And what is kind of actually the case as more and more archaeology has started to show is that the Seleucids were a bit of both, is that they towed the line between both of these. Is that yes, they did kind of colonize and in certain cases force Greek institutions on the locals, but on the other side, they very much slid into and incorporated themselves into the local tradition as it existed under the Achaemenids. So it's not fair to say that they were colonizers or that they were these continuators of the Achaemenid Empire. It lies somewhere in between, and it really takes a lot of sussing out in order to kind of more holistically understand the process of the Seleukid Empire and how they used all of these different kind of imperial topographies of power in order to show their own kingship. So one such thing is these horns that appear on this rare tetradrachm mint. And we see that we have a dioscoroi on a horse, a charging horse with its horns, so a symbolism that we've seen before. And it has the spear pointing out, and then we have these horns, perhaps calling back to the bull of Amun, but also we could make a very strong comparison to the stele of Naram Sin here, and you can see that there is very much a continuation in the iconography between what we have with this spear here and with these horned helmets. So the horns are more apt to be kind of compared to what we see from Naram Sin with this kind of Akkadian example, or perhaps even Assyrian examples, than what we're seeing with those horns of Amun. So we're seeing this kind of use of combining all of these different motifs, so stuff that we've had from the Akkadian period, stuff that Alexander is taking from Egypt, and all being combined into this unified system that can speak across multiple levels, so that for, say, someone from northern Mesopotamia, they would see these horns as speaking to the Akkadian or the Assyrian precedent. For someone from southern Mesopotamia, they may see these as speaking to the Babylonian precedent. From someone that is kind of on the further western reaches of the Seleukid Empire, they may be seeing it as something that's connected with Amun in Egypt. So it's able to speak across all of these different lines of people, as to where it's a single iconography, but it has many different kind of interpretations or narratives packed within that single iconography. And that's really what makes the Seleukid art so interesting, is that they can combine all of these different narratives into this singular form. And someone asked on the last discussion why we're looking at so many coins. And I answered that is because, one, I really like coins. I think coins are absolutely amazing, and they're cool and really awesome, and I can't speak enough about how cool coins are. But the second thing is that these were the best way to both test out an image. So as we saw with the Ptolemies, with Ptolemy the First, how he tested out a gold coin with the upper echelons of society, and using his own iconography of his own face, it seemed to have gone well, so then he put it down into a silver issue, which then was more widespread. So coins very much were able to spread the image of the king across their entire empire. And look, we will look at some more coins now. So what we have here is Antiochus IV and Demetrius I, and you'll see that we've moved along. So we're very much, we're 100 years into the Seleukid Empire by now, and you'll see that they've gained in comparison with the previous one, where we just have Seleucus's name and Basileus on this side here. So Seleucus the king, or of the king Seleucus. They've moved on very much wholesale into taking on the ideas of divine kingship. So here, Antiochus IV has taken on the name Epiphanes, and he has basically taken these divine titles. And same thing that we have here, we have Demetrius Soter, so the savior. He is taking on this idea of this godly savior. And again, with Antiochus, he has Theon on it, so of the god. So they're very much playing with these ideas of being divine kings. But as you can see, they're still kind of beholden to that idea of Alexandrian portraiture. So they have this lovely flowing locks, the diadem, and here his hair isn't as thick; it's a bit flat. But he's here. Antiochus has just some lovely locks. And on the reverse, we have Zeus seated with Tuke or Nike, crowning him with this laurel diadem. We have that very standard iconography of Zeus. And on this side, we have Tuke or Apollo. It could be, this could in fact be Apollo, seated with an arrow or a scribe, and with the cornucopia. So moving on to city foundation, this again is one of those important things as being a king entails. And as we've seen so many times before, is that founding cities is what kings do. So some of the important ones that we will look at, we have Seleucia on the Tigris, founded about 305 BCE, the Tetrapolis, so including Antioch on the Orontes, modern Antakya, Turkey, founded around 300 BCE. We have Dura Europos, which was this major trade outpost on the Euphrates River, around 303 BC, and a site called Ai-Khanum, which is the modern Uzbek name of the site in Afghanistan that was founded around 280 BCE. So as you can see, these span across basically the entire empire. We have Antioch on the Orontes here, all the way on the Mediterranean Sea in modern Syria / Turkey. We have Dura Europos on the Euphrates River, Seleucia on the Tigris here, south of modern Baghdad, and then Susa, which we've seen before, Persepolis, and then moving all the way over into the far eastern reaches of the empire with Ai-Khanum, well into the upper reaches of the city or the state of Afghanistan. So as we spoke about at the beginning of this lecture, they basically largely abandoned Persepolis. After the coming of Persepolis, or the essential ruin of Persepolis under Alexander, the Seleucids essentially ignore it completely. They don't really engage with it at all. With Pasargadae, as we saw with that coin of Seleucus I, excavated at Pasargadae, they mainly just seem to have used the citadel, the Tali Takht, and it seems to have been kind of a backwater administrative center. With Susa, they essentially allow the palace to decay. So that large Apadana mound, they allow it to fall into disrepair. And they come in and take over the lower parts of the site so that, as we'll see on the site plan later on, they basically use the Apadana of Persepolis or of Susa, the Apadana of Susa, as this massive anti-monument, as they let it decay, and it kind of shows the decayal of the Achaemenid state and Achaemenid power and the rise of Seleukid power. And they reuse the palaces of Babylon and Ecbatana. Basically, they just move right in, and it becomes their own palace. So speaking of Babylon, the Greeks come in and they construct this massive theater here. As you can see, a theater is one of those kind of main things that are required for a city to be a Greek city. And they also refound some of the temples that had fallen into decay. And again, they take over the South Palace and the Summer Palace as residencies. And this is where Alexander died. He died in Babylon, as I mentioned in the last lecture. So this became a very kind of important cult site in and of itself as to for them to be able to control Babylon as the site of Alexander's death. It was incredibly important. So while they didn't have the body that was in Alexandria, they did have the site of his death. Now, two records exist from these early parts of the empire is the so-called Borsippa cylinder of Antiochus I and the Esagila Chronicle of Antiochus I. Now, Borsippa is the site of the Azida Temple, which is a huge ziggurat of Nabu, which is about 10 miles south of Babylon. And the Esagila Chronicle is what we've already talked about, the Esagila complex with the Temple of Marduk. So that the Borsippa cylinder talks about how Antiochus, the great king, the mighty king, king of the world, king of Babylon, king of all countries. So that's something that we have definitely seen before with the Achaemenid titles. So we're kind of appropriating the Achaemenid titles here. And we could, in fact, make a comparison with the Cyrus cylinder. So it may be that while the Cyrus cylinder itself was definitely buried, it could be that Antiochus I came across, or the kind of narrative of the Cyrus cylinder was continued on into all the way into the Seleukid period, as to where Antiochus was able to kind of make his own Cyrus cylinder. And it talks about how he refounded the Esagila and Azida complexes. And it talks about how he made the bricks, the very first bricks of these complexes, with his own hands. So again, getting into that idea of the king as builder, or the king as architect, that may remind us of Gudea with his architect plan. Now, the other is the Esagila Chronicle, which talks about how he, Antiochus, refounds the Esagila complex. And what's really interesting is that it talks about how he falls down. So the Babylonian word used here is not the word that they use for like falling down in prayer of proskynesis, but literally if you trip and fall. So it was recorded here that as Antiochus I was going to make an offering to the Esagila complex, he essentially falls down and kind of embarrasses himself in front of everyone. But what's really fascinating is that on the backside of this is there is this kind of a couple of texts that talks about how there's essentially that it says that the son of the king intends to release this person that has been arrested and is to be put to death. But another guy tries to prevent that by denouncing the guy to be released, because he's afraid that he's going to get denounced instead. The translation's really hard to read, but apparently it has something to do with the workers on the Esagila complex. When it was being constructed, they did something wrong, that there might have been some sort of sabotage on the restoration of the Esagila complex. It's one of these really fascinating things that really tells us about how and kind of shows us that the people of the ancient world were very much like us today, is that we have all of this types of drama, and it's like he said, she said, no, they did it wrong. That's, it's very much, it kind of really brings them to life. So I definitely recommend, if you're interested, go and look at the reverse reading of the Esagila Chronicle, because it's absolutely fascinating. So the theater, again, as I said, that you can't have a good Greek city without a theater, and we'll see that definitely coming up. Is that the theater is always there, and this theater had many different many different renovations to it. And in fact, it met its largest size in the Parthian period, so the period that we will be discussing on Monday of next week. So this theater was used for plays, just as the kind of traditional Greek theater plays, pronouncements, everything that has to do with a theater. And it appears that this kind of shows up in Babylonian diaries as the place of seeing. So it kind of speaks to that place of going to see a play. So the Babylonian speakers, not the native Greek speakers, seem to have translated it into their own idiom as the Greeks understood theaters. So as I mentioned with Susa, this became a kind of an anti-monument. And the quote-unquote royal city is where a massive amount of Seleukid foundations were found with Seleukid cities, not made on a standard grid plan as we know it, as far as the archaeology has shown so far, but they essentially leave the Apadana mound to decay and to basically fall into ruin. And as I said, to kind of show that the Achaemenids are gone and the Seleucids are here to stay, is that while the Seleucids are rising, the Achaemenids are decaying. And you'll see here we have this Acropolis where the palace was located. So that main palace was located here, set apart from the regular part of the city. And that is very much a part of what else is important for the Greek cities. Unfortunately, we don't know if there was a theater in Susa. It either hasn't been found or it doesn't exist. But the other part of a good Greek city is to have this Acropolis, this citadel that's set apart from the rest of the city. Another site is Balkh. So this is way up in the eastern parts of the Seleukid Empire. And as you can see here, there are some lovely remains of very Greek-style column capitals, these Corinthian column capitals. We have this Taurus-type base, this Chaima reversa base. And we also have a kind of a set-apart city structure and a kind of fortified citadel type structure here with these massive walls that come around. And I'm just showing you these sites so you're aware that they do exist and that you can kind of go and learn more about them. We won't speak a lot about these sites, mainly just because we don't have time for it, unfortunately. But again, you can see here that this massive fortification wall, you can see the new city here, and here are the remains of kind of the Seleukid part of the city, and here are some more. You can just see the outlines of the outer city wall. And here is a lovely picture of some of that, and you can see the little cattle in the background, little grazing cattle, lovely. So another site is Merv. As you can see, we have this exterior wall where the regular part of the city would be and this fortified citadel type structure. So that's something, again, that is kind of that prototypical Greek city. So you have a set apart palace in a citadel, you have a theater, and you have kind of an outer wall and an inner wall. Those are the main components of what is a prototypical Greek city. So one thing that I want to talk about is kind of the fall of the Seleucids. We're definitely not done with the Seleucids, but I'd want to kind of jump ahead and go to the very end of the Seleukid Empire. And this was the statue of Hercules, his weary Hercules after his labors. It was created during the final years of the Seleukid hold over the Iranian province of Kermanshah, which is just over the border with Iraq, at the site of Bisitun, so as what we talked about with the Achaemenids. And this monument is dedicated to a certain Cleomenes, and it perhaps was as a last-ditch effort in his battle against the approaching armies of Mithridates I, of the Parthian Empire, as kind of his kind of last ditch effort to save either himself through dedicating something to Hercules, or to kind of save the idea of Greece and the idea of a Greek peoples as these Iranian peoples are coming down and about to basically kick out the Greeks. So one thing I want you to think about kind of throughout the rest of this lecture and throughout the rest of the semester is, why would the Greek kind of satrap build or construct a monument of Hercules at Bicêtre? What is kind of the impetus for him to do this? Does it have something to do with Darius's monument? What is the idea of kind of reusing this site of power, that has Bicêtre being a site of imperial power? What is the purpose? And I really want you to kind of think through that. Is what is going on here? Why did they build this statue at this place? And it is definitely a chubby Hercules, and for some reason, here's I guess your fun fact, during the Iranian Revolution, his penis was knocked off. So perhaps they just really didn't want to see Hercules's penis, and they knocked it off. So that was your fun fact for the day, I suppose. So Antioch on the Orontes was one of those major sites as well, and it has definitely lived on. But you'll see here is that we have this citadel, that imperial palace, that is set off by a river, so the Orontes River, and the rest of the city here, and it has an amphitheater down here, and of course we have our theater. And this was one of those major sites of coming in from the Mediterranean for trade. You'd hit up Antioch, and then you'd move down to the Euphrates River, get to Dura Europos, and you would be able to bring trade in that way. So Antioch was one of those very important cities for bringing in trade from the Mediterranean and exporting trade from Iran and Western Asia. So again, we have those standard things that are associated with a Greek city. We have that citadel, the walls of the city. We have a theater, and the amphitheater dates more to the Roman times, but it is there. But Antioch maintains a very important place in the history of the Middle East and Western Asia, all the way until the end of our semester and well beyond. So moving to Seleucia on the Tigris, this is one of the cities that we're going to look at basically in depth. It was founded around 305 BCE by Seleucus I on the left bank of the Tigris River, about 30 miles south of modern Baghdad. This was the royal capital of the empire, so this was the essentially the seat of governance for the Seleucids, and as opposed to how the Achaemenids ran their empire, as to where they didn't have one actual capital, the Seleucids had Seleucia on the Tigris as their capital. Now, while the king would go around on campaign and visiting sites, everything was kind of centered on Seleucia on the Tigris. It was the same scale as Alexandria, so a huge, massive city, much larger than Antioch. And there was this colossal mound on the north side of the city called Tel Umar, and no real idea what its function was, and it confused archaeologists for a very long time. And of course, as a good Greek city, it was built on a Hippodamian grid plan with blocks of 140 by 70 meters. And that's compared to Dura Europos, which was 70.4, and Carex Phocenu, which was 160, which is the largest known Hippodamian grid plan in Western Asia. So the site, as I said, located south of modern Baghdad, which is just right up here on the Tigris River. And we went all the way from Balkh and Merv all the way over here in western or in the eastern part of the Seleukid Empire over to Antioch on the Orontes, and now all the way to Seleucia on the Tigris. So looking at the wider part of the site, this area is colloquially known in Arabic sources as Al-Madain, the cities, and Seleucia on the Tigris sits right here. As you can see, all of this kind of light, dead soil is where parts of the city actually exist today. This was an airbase that was constructed by Saddam Hussein in the 90s. And these sites here are all date to the Sasanian period. So as we'll get into in our last weeks of the class, we will come back here and talk about these sites. But Seleucia on the Tigris, as you can see, is this massive site, and it continued on well into all of these current farm fields, and you can see the remains of Tel Umar right here. And one thing you'll note is that you can see that there is a bit of kind of good growth here, and that corresponds to a central canal that ran throughout the whole site. So we have canals that come off of the Tigris River as it existed during the time of the Seleucids. And these canals set up and basically created an artificial island in which the palace would sit. So they essentially, it was mimicking Antioch on the Orontes. And because there were no big enough islands in order for them to be able to place a palace on, they created their own through these massive canals. And these canals ran and kind of split the city into parts in order to kind of replicate the idea of Antioch and Alexandria. And here is just an image for you to kind of understand how absolutely massive it is, as to where we only have, about 3/4 of the city is still excavatable. And the excavators only excavated a few city blocks. So just a little bit here, a little bit here, and a little bit over here. And there's all this rest of the city to excavate. And it was very much so packed with people. So there was, there's so much archaeological context and material here to still excavate that, you could spend an entire lifetime excavating every single year and still not get everything and get a good idea of just how massive Seleucia on the Tigris was. So looking at Tel Umar, here are some very fanciful excavators with their lovely little dog standing in front of it. These are the Americans from the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology at the University of Michigan. They still have a very good archaeological program, but it was excavated in the 1930s, and their plan was to find this site called Opis, O-P-I-S, and it was an ancient Babylonian site that was rumored to exist somewhere around the area where this mound was. So they believed, as part of their excavation permit, is they believed they were excavating the ancient Babylonian city of Opis. And they thought they were looking at a ziggurat. And it very much so fits the idea of a massive ziggurat. It's 16 meters above the plain. It has these solid blocks of unbaked bricks, and it was roughly square in size. You could understand it to be kind of rounded off because of age, but it very much fit the idea of this ziggurat. But when the excavators started to excavate, it ended up, they found out that some of these massive blocks really didn't fit the idea of a ziggurat. they had too much kind of architectural things associated with them, so rooms and different massive mounds that ended up kind of working themselves into a sort of kind of a curve. And it seems to be that they actually excavated, after a while, they started to realize that they were excavating this massive theater in the plain. So as we've talked about many times before, especially with Babylon, that the Mesopotamian plain is pan flat. So the Seleukos the First in 305 BCE said, well, we got to have a Greek city, and we can't have a good Greek city without a theater. So they quite literally constructed a mound itself. They made their own mountain, just like a ziggurat, but turned it into a theater in order to have that Greek city. So they brought Greek life and Greek culture with them to the Mesopotamian plain in order to found their city. And here is another picture of this. You can see part of right here corresponds to one of the corners of the site as the kind of the cavea comes down. And in the 1960s, the Italians came and excavated the site, and they produced some of these amazing 3D models of the site. So you can see here that CNES. So this comes along with those original excavators from the University of Michigan, finding really odd rooms that really didn't fit with a ziggurat. So they saw all of these rooms here, and you can see just how massive this site was. And here is part of the CNES itself, so you can see the rooms and how the theater itself climbs up into the back. And as you can see, this would have been a massive monument and that could be seen from all around, and a declaration of Greekness deep in the heart of Mesopotamia. So it really was a statement piece, a piece of saying, we are Greeks and we are here and we've brought our culture with us. And just a little bit that we will talk about this later on, but a Sasanian watchtower was sunk through the orchestra because, you know, it was a massive mound in a flat place. So the Sasanians are like, hey, we should use this because it is a good place to put a watchtower. You know, we're high up in the air. So looking at some of the 3D reconstructions, these were a 3D reconstruction that I did for a book that is in a book called The Iranian Expanse that I don't have around me right now, but these appear there, so you can read more about it there. But here you can see a view from the top of the theater down into the Agora, so the meeting place. So we're looking from here down into the Agora. And on this one, we're looking at from the Stoa over to the theater itself. Now, attached to the theater was this very traditional Mesopotamian Babylonian style temple. And there, at the very bottom of it, in one of the foundation deposits, was a sacrificed dog, which is very traditional for Babylonian temples, as to a dog would be sacrificed for kind of the consecration of the temple. So we have this Mesopotamian style temple attached to a incredibly Greek structure. So kind of speaking again to those both constituencies of that Greekness and that Babylonian or Persianness. So again, just I included some more of these for you to look at. You can see the Agora and theaters association with the city blocks around it, as well as with the Stoa and the archives and how the theater relates to that. And here is one of the site plans that were produced by the Italian excavators. And of course, this Cassiope this is in Epirus in Greece. Similar sort of structure here. So that's where we have a theater with a stoa associated. Same thing happening here. So things happening well into the heartland of the state of Greece proper are happening deep in the Mesopotamian plain. So located in the archives, these archives were later reused in the Parthian period for graves, as to where they essentially took the archives themselves, which were full of government administrative documents. And again, like I said, this was the capital of the Seleukid Empire. So this is where they stored all of that important archive stuff. And the Parthians came in, the next empire, and produced these kind of little underground grave type structures that we will speak a little bit about when we get to the Parthians. So here is just a site plan for you to study and memorize. Now, located within the palatial district is this so-called Heroon, which is about 100 meters southeast of the theater. And an inscription of 140 identifies it as a sacred site to the Seleukid family. So the cult of the Seleukid family, as I discussed at the start of this lecture. And it could have been kind of connected to the palace. We just don't know. There hasn't been enough archaeological investigation here to tell for sure. So again, one of those kind of important parts of the kind of Greekness is that creating that shrine to the ancestors, that shrine to the important people that are associated with the city. And here are just some seal impressions from Seleucia on the Tigris. We have Dionysus and Athena. Here we have Artemis and Apollo Nabu. And here is another seal with the dragon of Marduk associated there. And one really interesting thing is that a comparison between the seals that were found in Uruk, as we talked about however long ago now, and the seals found at Seleucia on the Tigris are exactly the same. So this kind of shows, this tells us about trade and administration across Mesopotamia, to where if it's the same seal, it's the same person making those seals. So it's this kind of gives us a view into the inner workings of the administration as to where documents and goods were traveling between Uruk and Seleucia on the Tigris. So the stoa, we should not have done one. The stoa is, as located right here, is that major part of the city where like the court of law would be held, where they would have little market stalls. It's kind of like that bustling hub, the mall of the ancient world. And it was a real massive place. And the stoa of Attalus was constructed at roughly the same time in Athens. And as you can see, it's just these ginormous structures that all sorts of kind of day-to-day regular activity would take place in. Looking then to Dura Europos, the site of which we will talk a little bit more about when we get to the Sasanian period, it was again built on that Hippodamian grid plan. So just like Seleucia, it has its own citadel that's set apart from the rest of the city. It has an agora. So all of the things that are associated with being a good Greek city. And this really was one of those trade entrepôts on the Euphrates, as to where it was a good stopping point for the Seleucids to be able to charge tax on goods coming in or going out of the Seleukid Empire. Now, one of the real sad things about Dura Europos is that it's located in modern Syria. And this image from 2014 shows a couple of trucks, these white trucks that are located all throughout the site. And these are trucks that were run by ISIS. And this kind of shows that ISIS came in and started to loot massive amounts of goods to sell on the black market from Dura Europos. And this is really one of those telling things You can see here in 2011, there are some grave robber pits or looters pits located throughout the site, but we can see it in 2016 that it has been completely and utterly decimated. All archaeological context is completely and utterly gone. And this question may come up, but all of these looting pits here that are on the outside of the city walls come from because the Sasanian Empire set siege to the city of Duriropos, and this is where their camp was. So looters trying to find Sasanian goods or anything that was dropped by traders coming in via the land route from Palmyra. So looking then to our final site, and I think we've got a lot to talk about with Iconium, and I really want to give it its due. So we are going to stop here for today, and we will talk more about Iconium in the next lecture and move on to the Parthians. So I hope that you enjoy. I'm recording this on Sunday, and it is absolutely snowing to beat heavens out right now. And so I hope you enjoy your little bit of winter that has come. So have a good rest of your day, of course, on Monday and Tuesday, and I will see you all on Wednesday. So stay safe and have a good one.